Hello guys, it's me again, Sleepy Historic Storyteller. So there's one thing I have to notice you guys that our channel is brand new and there's a lot of things that we have to improve, especially our contents. So that's why your support by subscribe, hit like to our video and leave the comment below so we can keep on developing the new contents to serve you guys for the good sleep. So that is the purpose of our channel. The main theme of story today I want to introduce to you guys is the beauty standard of women in medieval times. So let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Mirror of Morning Light. In a small attic room, beneath a slanted oak roof, the morning sunlight slipped quietly through a narrow window pane. The linen curtain, faded to a gentle gray, had been drawn aside and tied loosely, letting in a pale beam of golden light. On the wooden table below sat a round ceramic bowl filled nearly to the brim with still water. She leaned forward, her eyes soft and quiet, gazing into the faint reflection that greeted her from the surface. Her hair, long and chestnut brown, had been brushed carefully the night before, but now a few strands had wandered loose in sleep. She tucked her cord behind her ear and straightened the parting with her fingers, moving slowly as if she didn't want to disturb the hush of the room. The old wooden comb rested beside the bowl, worn smooth from use, its teeth slightly uneven but familiar in her hand. Outside, birds murmured in the distance, and from somewhere below, the muffled sounds of breath reached her ears. But in this small corner of the world, she lingered. There was no rush, no urgent task, just a bowl of water, a bit of light, and the quiet routine of a girl preparing herself for another ordinary day. She dipped her finger into the bowl, letting the cold touch wake her fully. Then, cupping a bit of water in her hands, she dabbed her face with slow, practiced motions, blinking away the last traces of sleep. Her breath was steady, her movements were simple, the kind of beauty that didn't ask to be noticed. And as the sun rose just a little higher, her reflection grew clearer, not grand, not flawless, but hers alone, cradled in the silence of the morning. That is the end of chapter 1. Now we move to chapter 2. Chapter 2. Bread for the feasting. Smelled faintly of warm wool and dried chamomile. Outside the shutters, the church bell rang softly in the distance, once, twice, then paused. It was the feast day, and the village stirred slowly to its quiet rhythm. On a low wooden stool, the girl sat with her back straight and hands resting on her lap. Her hair, washed the evening before with mint and rosemary, was still faintly scented, smooth beneath her mother's fingers. Behind her, the older woman moved gently, separating the strands with practiced care. Her hands worked in silence, weaving long braids with a slow and steady grace. She didn't rush. Today was not a day to rush. The girl blinked slowly, gazing at the embroidered cloth hanging near the wall. Roses, leaves, and vines stitched in colors that had faded over the years. It was the same cloth her mother had made when she was young, when her own mother had braided her hair for feast mornings. The house was quiet, save for the creak of the stove, the brush of fingers through hair, and the occasional murmur of pigeons on the rooftop. Somewhere outside, someone was sweeping a doorstep, and the low clink of a pot echoed through the stone alley. Her mother began to hum, not a song with words, just a tune she'd known since childhood. The braids grew longer under her hands, tied gently with soft cloth strips dyed in pale blue. When it was done, the girl stood and turned. Her mother brushed the loose hair from her temple, then stepped back and looked at her with eyes that had once been as young. They didn't speak, but the moment was full. Outside, the bell rang again, and the morning sun crept quietly across the floorboards. That is the end of chapter 2. Chapter 3. Scent of garden herbs. The garden had not yet shaken off the weight of dawn. Dew clung to the low leaves, and the path of worn stones was still slick from the night's dew. A quiet hush hung in the air, as if the earth had just awakened and was still stretching in silence. She stepped softly through the narrow rows, her hand brushing against the pine and creeping mint. In one hand, she carried a woven package. In the other, small scissors with handles shaped like a bird's wing. The herbs waited for her. Clusters of rosemary leaned gently toward the morning sun. Lavender stood still, its scent holding the purple buds not yet warm. She knelt near the chamomile, its white petals glowing faintly with droplets. With each snip, a scent rose, light, clean, and deeply familiar. It was her mother's garden once. The same stones, the same rows. She remembered watching those same hands gather herbs, rinse them in cool water, and leave them on cloth to dry. The scents hadn't changed, only the hands had. A soft breeze stirred the linen scarf over her hair. Birds called from a rooftop somewhere nearby, but she paid them no mind. Her focus was slow and patient. She gathered each sprig with intention, laying them gently into the basket as though they might bruise from haste. Later, these herbs would find their way into washing bowls, into small cotton pouches tucked inside sleeves, into tea for headaches and hair rises. But for now, they were simply quiet, living things being carried with care. She stood at last and breathed in the mingled scent of mint, rosemary, and lavender. It smelled of home and of women who came before her. Behind her, she stutters. The house cracked open. Another day had begun. That is the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4. The sewing needle's rhythm. The room was quiet, save for the steady sound of needles slipping through fabric, in and out, in and out, a rhythm as old as her hands, older even than the house itself. She sat by the window, though the light had long faded from the sky. A single candle burned on the low table beside her, its flame swaying softly whenever she moved. Shadows clung gently to the corners of the room, but she paid them no mind. On her lap lay a strip of fabric, the width of her palm, marked faintly with chalk lines. The pattern was one she had used many times before, small vines curling into roses, the kind that seemed to grow only in thread. Her fingers moved carefully, with neither hurry nor pause. She did not count the stitches. Her mind did not wander. The work was not a task. It was a moment, one she had lived through every evening for years. Somewhere in another room, the fire had dimmed to a hush. A spoon tapped once against the pot. The floor creaked faintly as someone passed, but no one words were spoken. She adjusted the thread and continued. In, out. The fabric warmed beneath her touch. She had learned to keep it taut without pulling, to let the needle guide her, not the other way around. There had been a time when her mother stitched beside her. Now, only silence kept her company, but it was not an empty silence. It was full of all the nights that came before, of quiet music in the thread, of memories sealed into hams and sleeps. The rose she finished tonight would sit near the cuff of her of a dress, or maybe at the hem, there where no one would notice at first. That didn't matter. The beauty wasn't in being seen, it was in the doing. Outside, the wind shifted. A shutter rattled gently. She did not stop. In, out, in and out. The needle moved like breath, and the fabric slowly bloomed. Now we move to chapter 5. A gifted comb from Bruges. Wrapped in soft wool and nestled down at the bottom of a small wooden box, the comb waited. It had traveled far, across muddy roads, through crowded cars, over bridges dusted with early snow. It had passed between gloved hands and behind curtained stalls, a modest treasure tucked among seals and spices. And now it lay still, resting in a quiet house where the fireplace breathed gently against the chill. She opened the box slowly, careful not to disturb the cloth too much. Her fingers paused just above the comb, as if touching it too soon might wake it up from sleep. It was made of dark cherry wood, carved with a pattern of tiny curling leaves. The teeth were fine, close together, polished smooth along their edges. It was heavier than it looked, and warmer too, its weight full of stories she would never know. Her father had brought it back from Bruges, tucked carefully into a corner of his pack. He hadn't said much when he gave it to her, only nodded and muttered something about the market, the rain, the long walk home. She remembered the way he handed it to her, as if passing a loaf of bread or a folded cloak, something simple but quietly important. She lifted the comb now, turned it gently in her hands. There was no mirror in the room, but she knew what it would feel like to roll it through her hair, not just smoother, but steadier, more real. She didn't use it right away. Right away, she simply held it, letting her thumb trace the carved leaves. Outside, the day remained gray and still. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere in the distance, a cartwheel creaked over stone. She closed the box again, placed it back on the shelf, and returned to her sewing. The comb would wait, but it was hers. Chapter 6. A whisper behind the veil. The marketplace was winding down. Stones, once loud with haggling voices, had grown quiet. The air smelled of cooled bread and faded lavender, with the last bits of sunlight slipping between the canvas awnings. Two girls stood by the fabric stall, their voices low. One held a folded length of pale linen, the other a veil made of finer weave, thin enough to see shadows through, thick enough to suggest mystery. They didn't speak with urgency. Their words were soft, scattered between glances and small laughs, the kind of conversation that carried more meaning in pauses than in speech. One girl lifted the veil to her face, letting it fall gently across her brow and over her nose. The other tilted her head, squinting as if imagining how it would look beside a pair of earrings or a braided ribbon. They didn't need a mirror. Their eyes told them everything. The fabric seller sat nearby, half dozing beside his bundles of cloth. He didn't interrupt. There were not these were not customers in a hurry. They were dreamers, linger in the last light of market day. A breeze caught the corner of the veil, and it fluttered like a small flag before settling again. The girls giggled quietly, but not in a way that disturbed the peace. One of them whispered something. The other blushed. It might have been a name, or a plan, or nothing at all. The veil did not say. Their hands brushed as they refolded the cloth, and for a moment they both looked down at the patterns, the stitching, and the price tag. They wouldn't ask just yet. They would come back, or maybe they wouldn't, but the veil had already done, and it needed to do. When they turned to leave, the shadows had lengthened. The stall stood empty for just a moment longer before the fabric seller yawned, rose slowly, and began folding up the day. That is the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7. Blush up the berry juice. The basket was half full when she stopped picking. Her fingers were stained deep red, sticky with the juice of late summer berries. Around her, the brambles rustled quietly in the breeze, their tiny thorns tugging at her sleeves, but never drawing blood. She found a patch of soft grass nearby and sat down, tucking her dress beneath her knees. The sun had begun its descent, casting everything in the soft amber glow. The leaves, the stones, the skin of her outstretched arms. From the pouch of her side, she drew out a piece of cloth and wiped her hands slowly. Then, glancing around, she plucked one perfect berry from the top of the basket. Round, dark, and just beginning to split. She brought it to her lips, but didn't eat it. Instead, she pressed the juice gently to each cheek, one after the other. The coldness surprised her. A second berry followed, rubbed faintly across her lips, leaving behind her a red far softer than paint or powder could ever manage. She had seen women in the village use rough from a tin. Hers came from the hillside. There was no mirror, but she could guess the effect. A little color, a hint of warmth, something just enough. Not for anyone else. No eyes were watching, just for herself, and perhaps the wind. The moment passed as lightly as it had come. She smiled and ate one berry, then two, letting the sweetness linger. Far below the hill, the bells from the chapel began to chime, The sound floated up gently, weaving between trees and head gray growths, until it settled near her feet. She stood, gathered her basket, and brushed her dress clean. A few berries had left stains where they'd fallen. She didn't mind. Beauty, like juice, was meant to fade. That is the end of chapter 7. Chapter 8. The Dance of Linen Skirt. There was no music, only the sound of wind moving through the trees and the quiet creak of old floorboards beneath her feet. She stood alone in the upstairs room, where the light from the high window fell in long golden slants across the stone floor. Dust drifted gently through the air, rising and falling like unseen petals. Her skirt, a simple piece of undyed linen, hand-stitched at the hem, moved as she turned, not in a practiced dance, but something softer, half forgotten, more feeling than form. She didn't count steps. She didn't need to. It had started with a stretch, then a sway. Now her bare feet traced slow, looping circles on the worn floor, each movement steady, breathless, unhurried. The skirt followed her rhythm, lifting slightly with each turn, then settling again against her legs. It whispered in soft folds, brushing against itself like silk made of air. She closed her eyes. For a moment, she imagined a courtyard far away, with tiled stones and music played on flutes, a crowd of strangers watching. But the image dissolved before it formed. This moment belonged only to her, in a quiet room where no one else would come. No audience, no candlelight, no applause, just light and dust, and the weightless feeling of turning in her own space. A smile touched the corner of her lips, not wide, not deliberate, just something that rose like a bubble and stayed there. When she stopped, the skirt settled like water around her knees. Her breath was steady, her arms still gently curved in the air before her. The wind knocked the window slightly. The light moved a little across the floor. She did not bow. She was no end to this dance, only stillness again. That is the end of chapter 8. Chapter 9. A Song by the River Bank. The river was low that afternoon. Smooth stones peeked out along the edge, warm under the sun, and the water moved slowly, with hardly a sound. She had finished her weaving early and wandered down alone, carrying a bundle of damp cloth and a small bar of soap wrapped in linen. The path to the water was lined with a soft grass and the scattered feathers of passing birds. She rolled up her sleeves, dipped the cloth, and began to wash, not with urgency, but with steady rhythm, soaking, wringing, then soaking again. The water, though clear, was cold enough to sting her fingers. She didn't flinch. After a while, she sat back on her heels and looked at the current. Thin reeds swaying on the opposite bank. A beetle crossed the surface, like a dancer on glass. The bundle of cloth lay beside her, clean and dripping. There was nothing left to do but wait for the sun to do its part. So she sang, not loudly, a hum at first, then worse, a tune with no name, only remembered shape, something passed down, perhaps, or made up long ago, the kind of song that belonged to riverbank and work-worn hands. The sound drifted across the water and into the trees. It stirred nothing but the leaves. She lay back in the grass, arms behind her head, her hair fanned out like threads across the mossy bank. The sun kissed on one cheek and then the other. The song faded. Her eyes closed. Downstream, a pair of ducks glided past, quiet as thoughts. No one heard her sing, but the river always listened. That is the end of chapter 9. Chapter 10. When the candle softly burns. The rest of the house had gone quiet. Even the floor, which is usually cracked beneath footsteps and shifting chairs, seemed to rest. She sat alone near the hearth, though the fire had long since dimmed to embers. Beside her, on the narrow wooden table, burned a single candle, short, thick, and flickering. The light it gave was not bright, but enough. Her sewing had been put away. Her chores had been done. There was no task in her hands now, no duty calling her, only stillness, and the soft glow that painted golden shapes along the walls. The wax slid slowly down the side of the candle. She watched it form a small curve at the base, like the edge of parchment left too close to heat. She didn't move much, just sat, back straight, hands in her lap. Her eyes followed the tiny flame as it tilted and trembled with the faintest drabs, shadows stretching, shrinking, changing with every flicker. The world outside had vanished into night. The shutters were closed, the sky unreadable. Yet, in the quiet of the room, she felt no fear, only a calm as round and steady as the melted wax pool beneath the wick. She reached forward once, gently cupped her hands around the flame, not to smother it, but to feel its warmth. It danced in return, steadying in her shelter. There were no thoughts she needed to think, no questions to answer, no tomorrow to worry over. The day had folded in on itself like a blanket, and this moment was the hymn. Somewhere behind her, a beam cracked. She didn't look. The candle burned on. That is the end of chapter 10. Chapter 11. The gown. It hung a peg by the window, where the morning light could find it first. The gown was not new. Its stitches had been resumed, its sleeves shortened, its hand let out once, then again, but it held itself with quiet pride, swaying faintly when the wind crept through the cracks in the shutters. She only wore it on Sunday, and only after her hands were clean, her hair smoothed back, and the rest of the wig folded neatly behind her. It was made of soft wool, dyed a shade between gray and blue, like river stones just before rain. At the cups, someone long ago had embroidered a row of tiny stars in faded thread. She didn't know who. The dress had passed through too many hands to trace, but it fit her. She didn't rush as she took it down. Her fingers checked the seams out of habit, felt along the mended shoulder, the spot at the waist where the fabric had begun to thin. She knew each thread, each worn patch, like the lines on her palm. Slipping it on was a kind of ceremony, not grand, not sacred, but simple. A moment of stepping into something slightly finer, slightly softer than everyday things. Outside, the chapel bell was ringing. It would take time to reach the path, to pass through the gates and the hedgerow, but there was still a moment here between dressing and going. She looked at herself in the darkened window, not a mirror, but enough to catch a silhouette, the outline of sleeve and braid and skirt. And then she smiled, because Sunday had arrived and she was ready. That is the end of chapter 11. Chapter 12. The woven belt with flowers. The belt had taken weeks to finish. It wasn't for a wedding, or a festival, or even a gift. It had no grand purpose, no deadline, only a quiet rhythm, thread by thread, knot by knot, loop by loop. She worked on it in the late afternoons, when the sun leaned low against the window and the room walls filled with that golden hush that made everything feel slower. Her loom was small, just a frame of wood with pegs, but it held enough space for care and color. The belt was narrow, made of dyed wool in shades of green and brown, like moss on old stone. But what made it special were the flowers, tiny patterns woven in soft reds and yellow, petals shaped from colors, thread just wide enough to notice, just subtle enough to miss. She hadn't followed a pattern. The design changed as she went, shifting with her mood, her thoughts, the way the light hit the wall or the birds sounded outside. Some days she wove in silence, others she hummed under her breath, not a melody exactly, just sound to keep the rhythm company. The belt grew slowly, coiled beside her on the bench like a quiet companion. She never measured how long it had become. She only stopped when the colors felt complete. Now, as she ran her fingers along its length, she could still feel the softness of each bloom. Each stitch remembered something, a warm breeze, a passing cloud, a thought that never needed to be said aloud. She wrapped the belt around her waist and tied it with a small knot at her side. The flowers sat lightly at her hip, hidden beneath her apron, known only to her. It wasn't made to be seen, it was made to be worn. That is the end of part 12. Chapter 13. Mirrorless Reflections. There was no mirror in the house, not in the room where she slept, but not by the hearth, not even in the old wooden chest where spools of thread and combs were kept. There might have been one long ago, cracked, lost, traded, but now there was none. She didn't miss it. There were other ways to see. In the morning, the basin filled with rainwater would hold her shape, wavy, soft, and never still. At midday, a polished spoon, when tilted just so, showed a silver of her smile. And sometimes, in the evenings, when the window panes darkened with dusk, the glass would quietly echo her outline, just enough to strengthen her braid or tuck a thread behind her ear. But none of them were truly mirrors, and because of that, her image always belonged more to feeling than to sight. She knew how her sleeps felt when they rested on her arms just right. She knew the shape of her shadow when she walked into the sun. She knew how others looked at her when she laughed and when she didn't. And from that, she pieced together something truer than reflection. There was freedom in not knowing every detail. No fretting over lines, no watching for spots, no turning this way and that to catch the best angle. Just herself, felt from the inside out, shaped by gesture, warmth, and quiet repetition. She ran a hand down the front of her apron, smoothed it once, and stepped outside. The sky didn't ask her how she looked. It just greeted her with wind. That is the end of chapter 13. Chapter 14. A gallon for the hair. She didn't pick the flowers with any plan in mind. They grew along the hedgerow behind the cottage. Small, bright things that nodded in the breeze as if already halfway to becoming a memory. Daisies, mostly, a few sprigs of yarrow, some clover, pale and pink. Her hands moved without urgency. She gathered only what was willing to be gathered, never stripping full patch, never reaching too far. The basket on her arm remained mostly empty, and that was fine. When she returned to the bench near the kitchen door, she sat quietly, letting the afternoon light warm her knees. The thread she used was rough spun wool, pale in little cords, but strong enough to hold shape. She began with the longest spans, braiding them loosely, weaving in petals. With each turn, it was not perfect. Some flowers tilted too far left, others faced the wrong way. But as the garland grew, it settled into its own rhythm, more a circle of softness than a symmetry. She lifted it once to her head, then put it back down. Not yet. Inside, breath was rising. A kettle clinked on the iron hook above the fire. But here, in this small moment, she had nothing to do but thread one bloom after another, as if tying memories together by hand. At last, she placed the garland gently in her hair. It didn't sit straight. It didn't need to. A few petals fell behind her ear and stayed there. She didn't look for a mirror. She didn't ask how it looked. She simply stood, adjusted her sleeves, and walked into the golden light of the garden. The garland held. That is the end of part 14. Chapter 15. The lace's hands. It was wrapped in old linen, folded 3 times, and tied with a faded ribbon, the color of dry, wet. She kept it in the wooden box under her bed, away from dust, from light, from thought. The lace had been made long before her hands ever held a needle. Her mother's hands had shaped it, stitch by stitch, loop by loop, with threads so fine they barely held their weight. It wasn't meant for everyday use. It was the kind of thing made when hours were longer and distraction fewer, when silence was not something to be escaped but shared. There were no names sealed into the border, no initials, no date, but her fingers knew its story. She had watched it being made in quiet afternoons, when her mother sat near the window, with her head bent and her voice quiet. No lessons were given, but much was taught. She remembered the rhythm of breath, the pause before each new flower, the gentle shake of the wrist to untangle thread. Now she unfolded the cloth slowly, careful not to catch the lace of the edge of the box. The pattern was still there: tulips, stars, and a twisting vine that never ended. A little frayed at the corner, a little yellowed by time. She didn't plan to use it today. She only wanted to see it, to run her finger once along the border, to remember the curve of her mother's knuckle, the way she tied off each row with a sigh, barely louder than a thread breaking. Some memories are made not with stories, but with cloth. She folded the lace again, tied the ribbon without pulling too tight, and placed it back in the box. And as she rose, she felt the weight of nothing at all, just the shape of love sealed into silence. That is the end of chapter 15. Chapter 16. A letter scented with time. She didn't open it often. The paper had grown soft at the folds, and the ink had faded where her fingers touched it most. It wasn't a long letter, barely 6 lines, but it was written in a hand she hadn't seen in years, tilted slightly to be right to the right, with a line of time pressed gently between the pages. The scent remained faint now, just a trace, but enough. The letter rested in a wooden drawer with a linen lining, tucked beside a dried sprig of lavender, 2 ribbon ends, and a small shell from a day long gone. Nothing in the drawer had changed for seasons, maybe years. That was the point. She had received it in the late summer, on a day when the path was dusty and the postman whistled through missing teeth. The envelope had become smudged, warm, but from the sun, and slightly greased from the journey. But she had known the moment she saw the writing. It had been folded inside her apron for hours before she read it. When she finally did, seated on the back step with her feet in the shade and her heart full of noise, she hadn't cried. She'd only smiled once, small and real, and then pressed the time inside with care, because it had been in her pocket that morning, picked without thinking, and now it belonged there. Today she unfolded it again, not to read, but to hold. She brought the letter close, not to her eyes, but to her cheek, and for the breath. It was summer again, the sky wide, and someone still on the road coming home. That is the end of chapter 16. Chapter 17. In soft whispers. They made no sound across the floor, only the faintest brush, like pages turning in another room. The slippers were made of stitched cloth and lined with worn wool. Not elegant, not new, but they fit her feet like memory, like something had always been there. But she didn't remember when she first wore them. Only that, once, they were her mother's. The soles were thin and shaped by habit, curved slightly inward at the toes, smoothed down at the heels. At the heels, the right one tilted a little when she walked, a quiet shift she'd long stopped noticing. In the early morning, before the fire was lit, her steps moved through the house, like part of the wind, setting down cups, drawing open shutters, lifting the lid of the bread box. The slippers followed her everywhere, whispering across stone, the wood, the wood rock. She never rushed in them. They did not allow for rushing. Their softness made speed feel strange, like it was startled the walls. When she sat, they waited beneath her. When she stood, they moved without questions. Evenings were their favorite time, when the chairs had folded themselves into silence, and the light grew kind. She would walk from room to room without speaking, her steps the only sound, light enough to be forgotten, soft enough to be felt. And though no one ever commented on them, she sometimes imagined that the house knew, that the old beams felt her weight, remembered her rhythm, and missed her whenever she stepped outside the booths. But in here, in this space where red met brick and gold met candlelight, the slippers stayed, and with them her footsteps, quiet, constant, belonging. That is the end of chapter 17. Part 18. The Window in the Rain. The rain had started softly, like a question whispered through leaves. Then it steadied, never loud, never harsh, just present. She sat by the window with her chin resting in one hand. The shutters were open, but only just a single pane of glass, clouded at the corners, framed the outside world. Blurred trees, stone paths growing darker, puddles blooming one by one. The air smelled of damp earth and wool. She wasn't waiting for anything, not a visitor, not a break in the weather. It was the kind of sitting down only when there's nothing to do and nowhere to be. A quiet surrender to the hour. The window glass quivered faintly each time the wind sighed. Drops streaked the pane in slow, meandering trails. Some merged, some vanished. She followed them with her eyes, naming none of them, letting them go. In her lap lay a folded cloth she had meant to mend. The thread still waited beside her, threaded to the needle, but the task had dissolved into the rain, forgotten without guilt. She didn't speak. No one did, but the house seemed to hum with the weather. Roof beams shifting slightly, floorboards releasing their cracks one by one, as if relaxing too. Outside, the trees were motion without sound. Inside, everything was still. She pressed her fingers briefly against the cold glass, not for warmth, but to feel something real. Then she drew her hand back and folded into the other. The rain continued. She remained, and for a while, that was the world required. That's it, the end of chapter 18. Chapter 19. The soap made from goat milk. It was the color of green and shaped like a small river stone, smooth on one side, rigid on the other, where it had been poured into an old mold. It smelled faintly of rosemary, of something softer, like warmth left behind on fabric. She kept it wrapped in linen, tucked in drawer beneath her shawls. It was not for visitors, not for display. It was for mornings when the house was still cold, and the basin needed to be filled by hand. The soap had been made last spring on a cloudy day, when the goats were shedding and the rosemary was just beginning to push new green. She had stirred the mixture slowly, careful not to let the oil boil, careful to pour just enough. It wasn't a recipe, it was a rhythm. Now, in the grey light of morning, she unwrapped the bar and dipped it briefly in the water. Her hands cupped the ladder gently, not rushing. The foam was light, more like memory than matter, and it carried a warmth that had nothing to do with heat. She washed her face with both hands, moving from forehead to chin, as if shaping the day from the outside in. The scent rose with the steam, and for a moment the room smelled not of tombstone or firewood, but of rosemary and milk and something clean. When she finished, she dried her hands on the cloth she had woven herself. The soap was grabbed again, slowly, and placed back in its drawer. It would last many more mornings, but today it had done enough. That is the end of chapter 19. Chapter 20. Head ring on her finger. It was not shiny anymore. The silver had dulled, softened by time, by wear, by 1,000 small moments of being touched, turned, and remembered. The band was simple, unadorned, save for a tiny engraving on the inside, no bigger than a fingernail, merely worn smooth. She wore it on the middle finger of her right hand, where it sat comfortably, as if it had always belonged there. It had once belonged to her grandmother, before that to someone else, an aunt, or perhaps a cousin. No one could quite say. The stories had tangled themselves over the years, passed more by gesture than by word, but the ring remained. She never took it off, except to knead dough or scrub the heart, and even then she placed it in the same shallow dish by the window, never further than arm's reach. On some mornings, she would pause and twist it once, lightly, without thinking. A habit, a memory. It wasn't a symbol of love, not in the way songs spoke of. It was a symbol of steadiness, of the woman who came before, those who boiled water and stitched sleeves and walked quiet paths in soft slippers. She looked at it now as she turned the last of the laundry. Her fingers, red from the cold, the ring dulled and wet but still warmed beneath the skin. She didn't need to polish it. It wasn't meant to shine. It wasn't meant to stay. That is the end of chapter 20. Chapter 21. The whisper of silk threads. The threads barely made a sound. She pulled one between her fingers, stretching it slightly before setting it into place. It glided through the cloth with such softness that only the shift of shadow across her lap told her it had moved. Silk was unlike wool, unlike flax. It did not resist. It did not pull. It yielded, obedient and light, as though each strand carried a secret and shared it only with the needle. The fabric on her lap was small, a handkerchief for a cousin, or maybe a sleeve edge for a child's garment. The purpose didn't matter. What mattered was the making, the act of bringing something smooth and fine into the world, stitched by quiet stitched. She walked near the window, where the breeze could lift the hem of the cloth and tease the loose ends. Sometimes the silk twisted when she didn't want it to. Sometimes it knotted softly, like a sigh. But she never took it to heart. Silk disliked being hurried. Her grandmother had told her that silk remembered the hands that shaped it, that even after years it could feel where it had been pulled too tightly or sealed with haste. And so she moved with care. Outside, the wind danced through the trees, whispering against the walls. Inside, another whisper moved through her thread, through her needle, through the rhythm of her breath. When she finally tied the last knot and laid the cloth aside, the silk shimmered faintly, like water catching candlelight. She brushed the stray strands from her laps and sat still for a moment longer. The thread no longer moved, but its silence remained. Chapter 22. The feathered hat from the market. She hadn't meant to buy it. It had hung from a wooden peg behind the stall, slightly tilted, half in shadow, its shape somewhere between ordinary and curious. The brim was soft, not stiff. The color faded to the tone of dust after rain. But it was the feather that caught her eye. Long, brown, and curved like the end of a question. It bobbed slightly whenever the wind passed through the narrow street. She had touched it only once, lightly, just enough to feel that it was real. The seller smiled and but said nothing. That was the thing about markets. You could linger in silence and still walk away with something unexpected. Now the hat rested on the bench beside her, folded slightly at the edges from the walk home. She hadn't worn it yet. She wasn't sure if she would, but she liked knowing it was there. It wasn't a fine lady's hat, not something to wear to chapel or to gatherings, but it had a sort of personality, like it remembered every hand that had reached for it, and every shoulder it had brushed against. She imagined the feather had come from a bird that flew above the marshes, one of those tall, still birds that never rushed, even when startled. Later, she would hang the hat near the door. It would dry in the afternoon air, keeping its gentle bend, its quiet shape. And maybe one morning, when the sky was neither bright nor dull, she would wear it, not for anyone else, but simply because it felt like right weight for her head. Some things don't need to be useful. They only need to be kept. That is the end of chapter 22. Chapter 23. The warming shawl. It had no buttons, no fastenings, no clever design, just a length of wool, white and soft, worn smooth by years of use. The shawl hung by the hearth when it wasn't needed, draped over her back, smelling faintly of smoke, bread, and the memory of rain. Its edges curled inward from washing, and the stitching along one side had begun to loosen. Still, it held warmth the way certain hands do, quietly, without asking for thanks. She reached for it every evening. It wasn't always cold, but there was something in the weight of it, how it settled over the shoulders, across her back, around her arms, that reminded her to rest. The world could go on turning. Let it be. She had this. She wore it while stirring soup, while reading letters, while watching the window darken. Sometimes she forgot she had it on until she rose. It slipped slightly, and it slipped slightly, like a gentle reminder that it was still with her. her mother had knitted in pieces during long winters when conversation was low and hence needed something to do. The yarn had been dyed with onion skin and ash, giving it a color hard to name, something between gold and earth. There was a snag between the hem, cut once on the corner of a bench. She never fixed it. She liked the imperfection. It made the shawl feel like more alive. And in the deepest parts of the night, when candles had burned down and house gave it into silence, she would wrap it tighter, not for warmth, but for memory. Some things warm the body, others warm the light. That is the end of chapter 23. Chapter 24. Painting her portrait in the garden. The snow was wobbly, and the light kept shifting. Clouds moved in and out of the sun like passing thoughts. But he didn't ask her to move, not even once. She sat on the edge of the garden path, where the lavender grew wide and the rosemary leaned too far into the stones. Her hands rested in the lap, folded lightly. She didn't know where to look, so she looked down, just enough to seem thoughtful, but not sad. He said nothing as he painted, only the faint sound of brush on canvas, the occasional crack of the easel when the breeze grew playful. She hadn't worn her best, only the one that felt most like herself. Soft blue, slightly frayed at the sleeve, a patch near the hem from last autumn's firewood. She hadn't thought he would notice, but when she glanced at the painting, just once, before he turned it away, she saw the patch had been included. She almost smiled. Almost. Behind her, bees wandered lazily from bloom to bloom. Somewhere further off, someone was beating a rock. The garden smelled of warm dirt and thyme. But in the space between his eyes and the brush, there was only her. Not beautiful, not grand, just seen. When he told her it was done, she didn't ask to look. She rose carefully, dusted her skirt, and thanked him in a voice softer than she'd intended. She never asked what he thought of her, but sometimes, when standing by the lavender, she wondered what color he'd use for the shadows under her eyes, and whether he had painted them kindly. That is the end of part 24.